Hi, this is Kelsey, and we're going to be talking about the latest changes to FERPA and then what exactly is FERPA, that kind of thing. So here's just kind of some general teacher tips. So what is FERPA? For those of you who don't know, it's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It's a federal law that protects students' confidentiality of student educational records. Throughout this presentation, I tried to highlight in bold some of the important words and things like that. So just keep an eye out for those. Some other stuff, how does it affect the classroom? So just make sure you're careful with technology use in your lessons. Don't use websites that require students to enter personal information. So just be really conscientious of what they're asking of students. Keep any students' data that you might have physical copies of, keep it secure, same with electronics, and then respond to access requests. So what does it protect? Education records, so student grades, immunization, health records, student progress reports, academic or physical testing, GPA, or attendance records. So just kind of some things to keep in mind of protecting. So how to not violate FERPA: shred student documents, carefully screen vendors, online vendors as well. Be cautious about what you tell to whom, especially in like emails and things like that. So again, schools may disclose directory information, so things like name, address, that kind of thing, to third party if it has taken certain steps. So making sure that parents are aware, eligible students have the right to opt out at any point, and then also know when to release and withhold records. So if a school denies access to student records to a parent or guardian, parent of a student under 18, this is a FERPA violation. So again, just kind of depends on the scenario, what they need it for, that kind of thing. And then, so again, FERPA allows educators to share information about a student internally. So that's having conversations with other staff members. It could be sending an email. Just be careful of how much email or how much information goes into the email. So an employee has access to certain information. So that means a teacher can share students' grades with the registrar, contact a counseling office with concerns about mental health without consent, so those kind of things. So immigration customs enforcement in schools. So SROs are not required to report undocumented students. So again, SROs are not required to report undocumented students, obviously unless there's extraordinary circumstances involving public safety, law enforcement wants more information, that kind of thing. Because school is considered a sensitive location, and ICE officers and agents are to refrain from enforcement actions unless there's extraordinary circumstances, including public safety, that kind of thing. And then, so again, under FERPA, school districts must maintain the confidentiality of all personally identifiable information. So again, just kind of going off that, so SAT, ACT, when students fill out personal information, again, it's not required to be turned over to authorities, that kind of thing. Access to students' records should only be allowed if the requesting agency has a valid court order or subpoena in compliance with FERPA. And then there's a Supreme Court case that talks about that a state may not deny access to public education to any child residing in this state, so regardless of whether they're in the country legally or not. So that just ensures that they're safe to come to school. Okay, so with the big digital age, there's a lot to be considerate of, especially with a lot of online learning, that kind of thing. So digital record keeping, trying to keep that private, creating like safe ways to share information, so making sure that children's like information is kept secret. So there's the COPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which kind of has some obligations under FERPA and some under COPA, so trying to navigate that and making sure that children are covered completely. So the only people that should have access to student information should be parents, students, and third-party service providers. Schools need to make sure that they understand all these contracts and make sure that student data is always being protected no matter what the company. So there's a student privacy data law. So we've talked a lot about FERPA, and it stands for, again, Family Educational Rights Privacy Act. So this is a law. Generally prevents schools from sharing student data without parental consent. So having that consent is important. But there are obviously some areas where they might get shared. So disease outbreak, campus shooting, school could legally share students' education records with designated personnel and law enforcement. The Department of Education also consolidated a document, which is really helpful, that has a lot of questions and answers, just to make sure that all the information is kind of in one spot for people. So you can check that out as well. Surveillance cameras have been another thing with privacy and student data. So there's a Fourth Amendment which prohibits governmental entities such as public schools from conducting unreasonable searches. So this could kind of maybe fall under surveillance recording, and say that that's unreasonable searches. So some video surveillance could be in a place where there's low expectation of privacy, such as when they're in a public space. So that could be just walking down the hall, when actions are in plain view, that kind of thing. And then on the other hand, recordings made in locations where individuals have a higher expectation of privacy, so things like bathrooms, locker rooms, those are more likely to be an unconstitutional invasion of privacy versus like if you're just walking down the hallway, that one isn't so much. So it just kind of depends on location. So there's also an Electronic Communications Privacy Act that was done in 1986, which prohibits the intentional interception of any oral communication, except where one party to the conversation has consented to the recording. So this is mostly with recordings. So FERPA, so whether a recording is directly related to a student is a context-specific determination considering. So here are some factors of what might kind of happen. So that could be whether the recording is used for disciplinary action involving the student, whether the recording depicts an activity that would reasonably result in disciplinary action. So things like showing the student violating the law, shows the student getting injured, attacked, victimized, ill, or having a health emergency, whether the school intends to make a specific student the focus of the recording, and whether the content contains personally identifiable information. So with that, again, there's open record laws. So school surveillance recordings are often the subject of public records requests by the media, citizen groups, or third parties, so that's something to keep in mind. So again, there might be some redaction or segregation. Then the parents of each student to whom the recording directly relates have the right to access the entire record. While FERPA does not generally require schools to provide copies of education records, it does not violate FERPA to provide copies. So most of the time there's a lot of requests for footage, things like that, especially ones that capture student misconducts. Schools are prohibited from disclosing such recordings without having first secured written consent from the parents. So if there is an issue and law enforcement wants something, then they need to get consent for it. So here's kind of here's some ways that our school can make sure that we are FERPA compliant. So raise FERPA awareness, confirm that FERPA applies to you, which it does all of us in education. Know the rights, protections, exceptions. I just went over a few of them. And then choose compliant vendors. So again, figuring out what resources you're using in the classroom and if they're okay. Train all school employees. That's kind of what today is all about. Implement compliant policies and procedures. Encrypt files and emails. So again, be sensitive to that. Implement other prevention tools. So these are just some good tips. So some other tips for parents and students specifically: read everything that's sent home, ask questions why is it being requested, find out how your school defines directory information, request opt-out forms if you can, ask for a copy of policies on surveys, third-party access of student information, opt out of surveys, testing, or other processes that might make you uncomfortable. Ask for a copy of the school or district policy regarding request to access the education record, videotaping, photographing, that kind of thing. So ask for all of that. If a student's participating in an extracurricular activity and there's information up on a website, just make sure you be aware of that. Opt-out forms for anything, especially for military recruiters and them contacting students, you can opt out. Access logs, you can ask for that. Document if something does happen. And then, again, maybe change the policy of the school board if you're a parent or know a parent that's really upset by some of this stuff. So there's always that option. Best practices for data destruction. So schools have a ton of paperwork, ton of data. So there's not like really specific requirements around timing, that kind of thing. But they do recommend disposing or destroying documents when they're no longer needed. So I just put the data life cycle on there. So once they're managed, they no longer need it, they can destroy it, and that could be reasonable methods, that kind of thing. So just kind of depending on the place. So under the studies, audit for evaluation. So there could be some exceptions. FERPA requires that the PII from education records be destroyed when no longer needed. So like I mentioned, if they're done and not being used, you can destroy it. Here's some data destruction categories. So clearing, purging, destroying. So especially the online stuff, making sure that is safe as well. So effectiveness and efficiency, making sure privacy of education records maintained. Parents can have certain rights that we've talked about. That includes the right to inspect and review educational records, control over disclosure, and yeah. So PSD and FERPA, so I copied and pasted their written consent, things like that. So it says, in accordance with FERPA, under PSD policy, a student's education record will not be released to a third party without written consent unless such disclosure is permitted under FERPA. So again, FERPA protects the privacy of student education records. So again, just emphasizing all the stuff we've talked about. This is just right on the Poudre School District website. And then it gives how to access records and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of information on that site. The student education record of eligible students can only be released to a parent with written consent from the eligible student. So there's some information there. And again, there's a lot of information of how to access it all online. And then there's my references. So thanks for listening about FERPA. Again, reach out if you have any questions.